Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm Lori Marino. I'm the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project. I'm joined by Catherine Doyle of the Performing Animal Welfare Society and Bob Jacobs, a professor emeritus in psychology and neuroscience at Colorado. And we are three of the authors of the paper that we're going to be discussing today. So let me get things started with just a few points, and then we're going to share a PowerPoint, and we're going to just basically have a free-flowing discussion, conversation coming from those PowerPoint slides. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many as possible. So let's get started. Now, increasingly, the public in many parts of the world has become increasingly concerned about the welfare of captive cetaceans, dolphins, and whales, and less favorable towards captivity itself. Moreover, marine parks and zoos are closing in many countries, and this trend shows no sign of stopping. The objective of the present review was to examine the current well-being of captive cetaceans. The captivity industry wants you to think that the question of whether dolphins and whales can thrive in concrete tanks is closed. But we reviewed hundreds of studies and came to the conclusion that that argument is premature. While there have been some incremental improvements in some species and in some accredited facilities, overall, dolphins and whales continue to suffer abnormal and unhealthy conditions in captivity. And this is what many in the captivity industry don't want revealed. In fact, as we will discuss later, they continue to engage in unprofessional conduct by trying to usurp the peer-reviewed publication process. So let's begin. I'm going to share my screen. So again, the paper that we recently published in the peer-reviewed journal PeerJ is entitled An Update on Captive Cetacean Welfare. And you can see all of the co-authors there. You know, we were lucky to have Heather Rowley, who is a veterinarian, and a number of other experts on our co-author team. Now, just to give you a sense of sort of the scope of this issue, there are about 3,600 dolphins and whales living in captivity around the world. And that's in about 50 countries. Only a little more than 2% of them are accredited by any organization, and that includes the AZA. 81% of them live in concrete tanks. So what we set out to do is to ask the question, what is the current state of well-being for captive dolphins and whales around the world? We conducted a scoping review. We reviewed 246 peer-reviewed papers, 25 book chapters, several books, and 36 gray literature sources. So one of the things we did in our paper was review the captive environment as it stands in marine parks and zoos and aquariums. And this is where I want to start the conversation with my co-authors, Bob and Catherine. looking at the captive environment that these animals are forced to live in. They, as mentioned, most of them live in concrete boxes, and where the space that they're allowed is a minute percentage of what they need to thrive. And the enclosures themselves are pretty impoverished. Um, Let me ask Bob and Catherine if you'd like to add in anything.
Sure. I mean, when we say most, it's about 81% of cetacean habitats are concrete pools. The size of these pools vary, but they are all still very small. For example, an orca in its natural habitat can swim a straight line of 225 kilometers. To do that same distance in the Nagoya Public Aquarium, which is the largest enclosure that we have, that would take over 1,500 laps to cover that same distance in a day. And if we look at the smallest aquarium, the Marino Aquarium, it would take over 5,000 laps to cover that same distance. Now, one thing that did come up in the study is the cetacean welfare study, which is a series of 9 articles, um, said that enclosure size is not important. They found that enrichment was more important than enclosure size. There is a problem with that, and we saw the same issue with elephants too, because zoos will often say that enclosure size is not important for elephants. But there's a possible floor effect here. It could be that the differences in enclosure size for the captive environment is irrelevant to or not meaningful for cetaceans. They might be meaningful differences for a goldfish, right? The difference between a fish bowl and a large pool. But for cetaceans, this may be an irrelevant difference. The only way to get at this would be to compare much larger enclosures and much smaller enclosures to see if there's any difference in behavior. We also know that in these enclosures that dolphins will spend most of their time, about 85%, at the surface of a concrete pool because that's where they have more stimuli, the trainers, objects, food, and so on. But if they're in a more natural habitat, they will tend to explore deeper areas of the habitat, probably exploring the ocean environment, the natural ocean environment. So there's another fundamental difference as well. Noting that these enclosures, of course, are for the most part quite featureless. You can see the images here, basically concrete tanks that are painted blue and not a whole lot more. So the interactions or the stimuli that the dolphins receive or the orcas receive or the belugas receive is usually tied to the surface in terms of interactions with humans.
And I think I would add also that if anyone is familiar with the comparative psychology literature and how environment affects brain function and brain structure, that these kinds of environments are definitely impoverished environments. And we would expect to see changes in the brains of animals, including dolphins and whales, who were forced to live in an impoverished environment of this kind.
And I think it's important to note too that cetacean facilities are limited by things like by their available resources. So that's including physical, financial, and staffing. So what you're seeing in these facilities is really the best that they can provide with the resources they have rather than being built to meet the needs of these complex animals.
Mhm.
So, because obviously to do so would require enormous expenses. So, these facilities in the meantime are going to continue to struggle with meeting the needs of the animals.
Yeah, it's a good point. The thing about the next point, sociality, I mean, that is so important because anyone who knows these animals knows how socially complex they are and how important it is for them to live in a social setting of family and friends and just a hierarchical nested society. And that is very difficult to achieve in a captive environment, a marine park or a zoo, because it doesn't it doesn't really resemble the multi-generational hierarchy that you'll see in the wild. Animal individuals are taken out of the tanks and put into the tanks. They're transferred sometimes several times in their life. And so, the animals don't have any control over their social life. And for an animal like a dolphin and whale, that's pretty harmful to them. Any other points we want to make about feeding or interactions with humans?
Well, certainly in interactions with humans, I was kind of surprised at I wasn't surprised at the lack of literature on this, especially considering the amount of interactions between keepers and the public and captive cetaceans. And unfortunately, I mean, I think this is the case. We saw this in the case of elephants, and I believe it is, the same for other species as well. And that's certainly an area of research that, well, there needs to be much more done in that area.
Yeah,
Another thing I would point out, and this was also in the elephant paper as well, is feeding. I mean, what we're talking about for feeding for these animals is foraging behavior, which is a very complex social behavior, cognitive behavior, lots of cognitive challenges, and great portions of their time in a natural habitat is in fact spent foraging. That's what they were designed to do in terms of looking for food, catching food, and so on. Um, and you can't mimic that in an artificial environment where you're simply throwing usually frozen fish to these, directly throwing it into their mouth so they can eat it. This is a problem. This is something that is often misunderstood. It's not just feeding. The foraging behavior is really a complex set of behaviors that these animals were designed for.
Yeah. And I guess also too, I mean, I would say that, again, the area of like the keeper, cetacean relationships, we found there was actually more information on interactions such as training, and that training sessions for dolphins in accredited facilities were associated with positive welfare indicators, such as play behavior and behavioral diversity. And again, this is another area that needs more study. Also, positive reinforcement training in accredited facilities has been shown to decrease stereotypic behavior as well. Again, we'd like to see more, in that area, but so there are definitely some positives to looking more into the human cetacean
sure.
relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's go on to the next slide then. Okay. So here's where we get into some of the current welfare issues that we identified through the literature that dolphins and whales endure when they're living in zoos and marine parks and aquariums and so forth. It's pretty clear that the environment that they're forced to live in is impoverished from a physical and social point of view, as well as a cognitive point of view. So these are animals I've studied their brains for close to 40 years now, and these animals have the kind of brain that needs stimulation socially, cognitively, and so forth, and they're not getting that in the tanks. Marine parks try to make up for that with environmental enrichment, but we'll talk about some of the problems with that later. What do we see? Well, of course, one of the things that we see is stereotypies, which are repetitive behaviors. And we see this in all species who are kept in captivity. That could mean circling in a tank or some kind of repetitive swimming pattern. It's also something that's very well known in orcas. 69% of all captive orcas have teeth that are worn down because of an oral stereotypy that they perform, which is just grinding their teeth on the hard surfaces of the tank. This is something that you just don't see in the wild, but it is certainly something you see across the board in many other species of different kinds when they're under chronic stress in captivity. And that leads to all kinds of opportunistic infections, systemic infections, and so forth. In terms of aggression, again, um, these animals living in the wild, there is aggression. Of course, they fight, but they also have a lot of room to disperse. And so dispersal becomes a mechanism by which they can tamp down aggression and keep it from escalating. But that's not possible in a tank. And so what you see are escalating aggressions towards each other as well as towards trainers, humans, and the fact that orcas, for instance, have harmed humans, many hundreds of incidents, and have killed 4 people in captivity, but not ever in the wild, is something that is indicative of the kind of stress that these animals are under in captivity. Bob, Catherine, do you want to say anything else about brain and behavior?
Yeah, I want to say that stereotypies are not seen in animals in their natural habitat. They're only seen in animals in captivity, whether it's cetaceans or elephants.
Mhm.
And it's not just a behavior, it actually represents a disruption in the motor circuit controls in the brain. It's actually a sign of brain damage. Um, and one of the reasons that enrichment is required for captive cetaceans by accrediting associations is it helps to alleviate these kind of abnormal behaviors. And with regards to aggression, I would add what I find surprising is that we don't see more aggression towards humans in captive animals. It's never mentioned. I think the Stockholm syndrome is probably relevant here. You don't attack the hand that feeds you, would be my thinking about this. Although no research has been done on this, it is something that would be worth looking into, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In addition to neurological problems, which these behavioral problems are a sign of, there are still a lot of common physical, excuse me, health problems, opportunistic infections. Now, it's certainly clear that animals in the wild get sick and die. They get pneumonia, they get gastric problems, all of that happens. We're not saying that it only happens in captivity. What we are saying is we need to look at why it happens in captivity, because in the wild, there are several identified risk factors for poor health. Those factors don't exist or aren't relevant to the captive situation. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are they getting sick? Now, there are some diseases of captivity. In other words, diseases that dolphins and whales get in captivity that are more frequent in captivity than in the wild. Things like fatty liver disease, elevated iron, hemochromatosis, uh, hypocitraturia, which low levels of citrate in the urine, tattoo skin disease, which animals get in the wild, but it's pretty common. Over 20% of bottlenose dolphins held in U.S. and European facilities have been shown to have it. Dental disease and gastric ulcers, and that's very, very interesting because there is a strong relationship between gastric problems and chronic stress and gut microbiota that exist in captivity. So again, what we're saying is it's not that these animals are um, even sicker than those in the wild, but there are reasons why one gets sick in the wild. None of those reasons pertain here. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is going on? What is killing them? Why are they getting sick? They have veterinary care, they have food, they've got clean water and all kinds of things. And yet we can't do better than the wild. So something's going on that we suggest might be inherent to the chronic stress of a captive situation.
No, I would say it's really important to note that, we're limited in studying this issue. We're limited to what's in the peer-reviewed publications, when in fact a great deal of the data on cetacean disease and illness is absent from the literature and it's publicly inaccessible. And
Yeah.
that's because the medical and behavioral records for these animals are routinely withheld by the institutions housing them,
Mhm.
including death data, necropsy reports, for deceased captive cetaceans. So there's a lot of value to this information, and unfortunately, it is not being shared. And so, like I said, so we are limited in what we know, and therefore the ability actually to help improve conditions.
But there are red flags there that
Yeah.
hope we can get to the bottom of, for the situation.
Um, with
Yeah.
regards to some skin diseases, they are seen in the unhealthy dolphin populations, but in captivity, one of the reasons you see them is because you have stress-related immunosuppression. If you have chronic stress, the immune system is suppressed over the long term, and that allows these kind of opportunistic infections. As regards tooth injuries or tooth disease, it's certainly true that animals in the wild will wear down their teeth depending on their diet. This is mentioned in the paper. But what we're talking about here is um, traumatic, complicated crown fractures, which is not the same thing as normal tooth wear. You can see the picture of the orca in the bottom of the screen there. So to avoid infections and so on, they will often do a pulpotomy where they grind the teeth off and take out the pulp. And that then mitigates the risk of systemic infection. But after that, they're flushed with antiseptic solutions daily, and the animals are often treated prophylactically with antibiotics, which affects which results in drug-resistant pathogens and altered immune system function.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, there is so much antibiotic resistance in the captive population that, that doesn't help when they actually do get sick. And one needs to scramble to find an antibiotic that actually works with them.
With regards to digestive and gastrointestinal diseases, one thing that really isn't addressed very much is disturbances to the gut microbiome and the effect that that has on chronic stress and depression. We know this from a variety of laboratory studies. We know this also from studies in humans. If you disturb the microbiota in the gut, it also has psychological consequences, and that's almost never addressed in any studies with captive animals.
And I think it's really important to note that the things we're saying here are basic scientific principles that we've known for decades. The relationship between the brain, behavior, chronic stress, immune system function, opportunistic infection is well known, well worked out across any number of species. And dolphins and whales are no exception. They have the same brain mechanisms, the same stress mechanisms, and the same stress hormones that we have in our bodies and other animals do. This is a highly conserved mechanism for dealing with stress. So when we talk about stress and the immune system and stereotypies and brain. This is not something that is new. This is something that is old, that we've known about for years. Just a note about longevity, survival, and mortality rates. It is certainly the case that recent studies have shown that bottlenose dolphins in accredited facilities may be living as long as some wild populations, and I would consider that an improvement. But the same thing cannot be said for orcas or beluga whales. So while there have been improvements in with some species in some kinds of facilities, those improvements have not been seen across the board. So we'd like to talk a little bit about environmental enrichment here because this is something that you see a lot about. People are writing about it a lot. There's a lot of good work being done in this area. And it's something that clearly the captivity industry has understood from the beginning is necessary for these animals to keep them healthy and is a requirement. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a requirement by accrediting associations to do a variety of things. One, to maximize psychological health. Two, to stimulate natural behavior. Three, to allow the animal variety and choices in their environment. Those are some of the reasons given by accrediting agencies. The bottom line, though, is that remember, this enrichment has to be added to the enclosure, and the addition of this ad hoc enrichment is really a de facto admission that the captive environment is inherently impoverished. You have to add something to it to make up the deficits. The question is whether this added enrichment really does make up the deficits between the natural environment and the captive environment. Historically, most enrichment for cetaceans comes in the forms of toys. So you can see here the orca playing with a tire, which is also a source of enrichment for elephants and rhinoceroses and so on. The question is, are these objects actually enriching? Animals tend to habituate to these fairly quickly. And we know from studies on enrichment that you have to change the environment fairly often to keep it enriching. That may or may not happen in captivity. More recent studies have underscored the importance of cognitive enrichment, that it's very important, especially for large brain animals like cetaceans. And there's been a lot of research in this area in recent years. And it's known that this kind of cognitive enrichment can diminish abnormal stress-related behaviors, at least for dolphins. It's been documented. The neuroscience research shows, however, that the natural environment is more enriching, both in non-human animals and for humans, not surprisingly. And dolphins that are in captive environments with more natural elements, sea pens or netted off areas, are less stressed and display fewer behavioral abnormalities than those living in tanks.
I'm gonna say I would just add to that that unfortunately enrichment activities, the cognitive enrichment is considered to be probably the most important type of enrichment for these animals, and that's also it's very time consuming, resource consumptive, and it tends to be implemented less frequently. And that's seen with other species as well.
Yeah. I mean, we need to know what works, what doesn't, why,
Mhm.
and how. So we're about halfway through the hour. We'd like to get to some of our concluding points so that we have some time to take some questions and have more discussion. I think it's pretty clear that the first concluding point that jumps out of any review of these animals' environment is the stark contrast between a natural environment and a captive environment. It just can't, I can't imagine that anyone who works with these animals in zoos and aquariums who are living in concrete tanks would actually think that they're mimicking the natural environment. And there are those who say, well, we don't have to mimic the natural environment. In fact, they don't have to hunt because we feed them. They don't have to do this because we do that for them. But I think that is fundamentally wrong. It shows a lack of understanding of who these animals are and the fact that they evolved for tens of millions of years in an environment where certain behaviors and certain environmental inputs were necessary for them to thrive. And when those are taken away, then these animals, who are wild animals, are not getting those inputs. things go awry, and then it's what we see, poor well-being, poor welfare in these animals. So there is still a tremendous contrast between captive environment, especially with concrete tanks. Dolphins in lagoons do a little bit better, um, and the natural environment. Anyone want to say anything more about that point?
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah.
Okay. Point two. Most cetacean welfare studies have been conducted on one species, bottlenose dolphins, and in a very narrow range of accredited facilities. Bottlenose dolphins in accredited facilities. But we have to remember that a very tiny percentage of captive facilities are accredited. And bottlenose dolphins are the most numerous, but there are many other species held in tanks like orcas and belugas. So certainly the case. I can understand why one would want to study bottlenose dolphins in accredited facilities, but that doesn't give you the whole picture of what these animals endure in captivity in general. And right, like we said, there's much less research on other cetaceans. Just to extend that, perhaps Bob, would you like to
Yeah, one of the
about
points.
China?
Yeah, one of the points that, or one of the things that came out of the review was that, again, most of the studies are on dolphins, not other species, other cetacean species. And most of the studies, if not all of them, are based on research in accredited facilities. There happen to be probably a lot of, or I'm not sure what the percentage is, but a great deal of facilities that are in fact unaccredited, and we don't have very much data from those. We do have some information from China, which of course has a growing industry of ocean theme parks. There's over 100 facilities in China with over 1,300 cetaceans. As far as we know, only one of these is accredited. I think it's the one in Hong Kong that's accredited. There is documentation that shows that a lot of the clinical problems and behavioral problems that we document in the paper have been shown by animals in these facilities in China. Most of these facilities, 95% of them, are simply there for human entertainment. So the animals are involved with doing various tricks and so on for park visitors. It's simply an entertainment industry. And the research that or the information that we have, it's not in a peer-reviewed study. It's in a brochure by the China Cetacean Alliance. It's really quite thorough. Estimates that only about 14% of these facilities offer any type of enrichment. This is important because one of the so-called solutions for the 30 beluga whales is to ship them to China. But these are the kinds of conditions they would be shipped to, and that's why that was not allowed by the Canadian government.
Yeah, I mean, that was the right call. Yeah, the welfare standards in China are not what they are uh, in the United States or even in Canada and some other countries, even though they're growing at this incredible rate. That's something that, I mean, I think it also brings forth the notion that things don't happen uniformly across the world, right? So things might be getting better in some places like Canada, but things are getting worse in other places like China. It's really quite uneven.
And I think lack of transparency too is part of the issue and having access to the information, kind of like, the health information we need here, but, yeah, similarly, we don't have well, there are local groups that are getting that information, I believe, firsthand,
Mhm.
but certainly there's not the transparency there.
Yeah, I mean, we have scientists in this country who go over to China regularly and
Mm,
are there at these facilities and they see what's going on.
yeah.
So while a lot of this still has to be put into the public literature, these scientists know firsthand what is going on there and what the record is.
Yeah.
One thing to point out here is this paper will be criticized for having reference to gray literature, web pages, and so on. Some information like government documents or even the web pages for accredited facilities, or in this case, you see the China Cetacean Alliance. Some information is only available in these kinds of sources. We tried to minimize as much as possible how many of these we cited. We also tried, in terms of citations, to limit our peer-reviewed references to articles since the year 2000, unless it was historically important to put in earlier studies, because that's another criticism that one often hears, is that you used old studies. So that's why this paper was done that way. And in this kind of area, some information is only available online.
Yeah.
Right. Point 4.
Yeah.
Okay. This is an important point and something that we are going to be following up on. We'll make the point that measuring welfare does not mean you're showing well-being. And that's something that's really important. There's a lot of good scientists studying welfare of captive dolphins and whales. But the question is, are there arguments being used to improve the lives of dolphins and whales? Where's the literature on that? Where's the evidence for that? We need to have the empirical evidence for how certain forms of environmental enrichment actually improve welfare. Bob, I know you wanted to say a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, there's a large literature, of course, on welfare for captive animals, including cetaceans. One of the questions that comes up, though, is, are these studies ever implemented into practice? Do we see the results of a study being used, for example, by a zoo or aquarium to actually measure welfare of the animals that they have? The information that is available suggests that probably not. Most of them are not. The studies themselves don't mention that they're applied in any way. We do know there are some exceptions. The seawell assessment for cetaceans, which is one of the assessment methods that actually attempts to measure positive welfare, including psychological welfare of the animal, has been implemented a fair amount. And we know that Clegg and Schutz just recently published, after our study was published, a 10-year update on the seawell assessment. And this reflects kind of a growing progress towards embedding welfare assessments in the daily care of captive cetaceans, and including positive welfare measures as well that look at not just the so-called physical health of the animal, but also the mental well-being of the animal. What you do not see in the existing literature are papers that say the animals are thriving in captivity. Very few papers actually address well-being. If you look at, for example, the Cetacean Welfare Study, which again is one of the most comprehensive welfare studies out there, it only mentions well-being one time in all of that. And I believe that's in a quote of another researcher. And part of the reason for this, of course, you can measure behavior, but you can't measure happiness. And so getting at positive well-being is a particularly challenging undertaking.
Last point, before we go to Q&A, because we only have about 15 minutes left. I think it's pretty clear at this point that we're not saying that there haven't been improvements in keeping these animals in concrete tanks. What we're saying is that we have a really long way to go to show any empirical evidence that they are thriving in marine parks, zoos, aquariums. As someone who has studied, we've all studied evolutionary biology. We need to ask ourselves whether we can bypass tens of millions of years of evolution and adaptation overnight. These animals are wild, they're not domesticated, and they are not doing well in captivity. So there is a deeper ethical issue that remains in terms of what we do about the situation. As I mentioned before, the public is beginning to really speak on that issue. There are many places that are closing because people don't want to see these animals doing tricks in concrete
Mm.
tanks. And so one of the ways that we can deal with this is by stopping the breeding, creating sanctuaries to move these animals to, which are another form of captivity, but are certainly much more naturalistic. And eventually hoping to have a time when these animals are not confined to perform for us and they're living in the ocean where they should be living.
Mm.
So I think it's pretty clear that these kinds of practices are anachronistic. It needs to end. Many countries are phasing out. France, Canada, Mexico, Belgium, many others will follow. We need to have a place for the retired dolphins and whales who come from these entertainment facilities, and that's why sanctuaries are important. But I think that the paper shows that despite some improvements, that after decades of keeping these animals in captivity, we have failed to provide an environment that is appropriate for them, that is healthy for them, and that allows them to thrive. And the question is, how many more decades do we need to show that these animals don't belong where we're putting them, in concrete boxes? So I'm going to stop sharing there, and we are going to take some questions.
Lori, we had one question that came in by email to me. They asked, about the title of this talk, that the captive animal industry didn't want this paper published.
Mm.
And they ask about, some of the hurdles or what was going on with that. Do you want to address that, or do you want?
Yeah, we'll address that, and then we'll move on. There have been the folks in the captivity industry have don't like the fact that we have been engaged in peer-reviewed publications showing that, for instance, dolphins and whales, as well as elephants, are not faring well in captivity. And there have been a number of issues with a number of journals where we've had a very difficult time having some of our reviews being overturned, some of our papers being accepted and then overturned. And in the case of this one, I'll simply say that this paper was reviewed by 4 people
Mhm.
and accepted by an editor, an expert editor, and at least one of those reviewers tried to overturn the publication process, tried to interfere with the peer-reviewed publication process. That person failed, and we just have to fight against it.
Laura, this is a question I think for you I just saw that says, please address the factor that cetaceans in any kind of man-made enclosure cannot dive to the depths they regularly descend to. This may be important to their physiology as well as the state of mind they have to dive to such depths of cold and darkness. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, certainly, I mean, diving is an interesting issue, right? Because it depends upon why they're diving. There are many cetacean species who regularly dive very deep. There are others who spend a lot of time on the surface in shallow water and then dive once in a while. For instance, we know that orcas like to dive deep and they like to spend a lot of time deep in the water column. And so if they are in a tank that doesn't allow that, that's going to be a stress. That's a standard definition for stress on an animal, is not being able to perform a natural behavior. We see the same thing with elephants, of course, as Catherine knows,
Mhm.
when they're not, when the environment just doesn't provide what they need. And it is certainly the case that many other animals might, like bottlenose dolphins, might live more on the top of the water column. There are many who are kept in captivity, like orcas, who don't and really need to utilize a much larger water column than they are given. There are some who are in tanks where the tail is touching the bottom and their head is out of the water, so that the
Mm.
water isn't even as deep as they are long. So, I mean, that tells you everything you need to know.
Mhm.
Somebody else here about the use of supplements with captive cetaceans. This person says they've seen many unusual supplements used that they felt were unnecessary. I think that's one of the interesting issues here is the use of prophylactic antibiotics and antifungals, which is very dangerous. And as you know, if you go to the doctor, he or she is not going to give you antibiotics unless you really need them, because of fear of resistance. The other kind of drug that is given pretty often is psychoactive drugs, Prozacs, other kinds of drugs that affect their brain, affect their, keep them easier to control. And that happens regularly as well. So a lot of these animals are drugged up, and that tells you again that these facilities are trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and trying to shoehorn it in with all these drugs, but it doesn't work.
Seem to be a lot of people asking about what they can do to get the message out or, why is this issue not getting enough media attention? Which
Right.
I would say I think it has gotten well, with Blackfish, of course, brought major media attention to the issue, so maybe it's more about how do you sustain the attention through the media.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because getting all of this information out to the public who are actually, I mean, the public, right, is everybody.
Mm,
But we can determine whether this practice continues or not. In the case of Canada, for instance, or in France, the public spoke and the public said no more. And I don't expect everybody to go into Google Scholar and read all the scientific literature and all the studies, but this is one of the ways that we want to get the word out through webinars, through other kinds of publications and posts, to help people, including students, realize that this situation exists, and that it's up to us to really keep that public education going. What is known about, somebody else, what's known about the stress for cetaceans of being continually visible, as opposed to having conditions where they can retreat somewhere where they can't be watched? That's a really interesting question, because what happens in marine parks is that these tanks are designed to allow people, visitors, to see the animals. They don't want people paying a lot of money to come in and then the animals are hiding somewhere in the back. They do this with elephants, well, where they design it so that there are very few places an individual can retreat to get out of the human gaze. Some literature that it pertains to this is what happens when these tourist boats go around in the ocean and do whale watching, dolphin watching. A lot of times, what they'll do is they'll go to where the animals are resting, feeding, nursing their offspring, because they know they can find them and they know that they'll be there. And we know that that's very disruptive. It's very stressful, very disrespectful, of course, and something that i- is is something that they have a hard time coping with.
Another question is, why do you think these facilities aren't making adequate changes to improve welfare? I think there are particular challenges with any zoo or any aquarium, and I think the challenge is even greater when it comes to cetaceans, because to improve the environment, you only get incremental improvements typically. Mass improvements would be extremely expensive. I mean, given the size of the pool versus the natural environment, making a very, 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 very large pool is going to be exorbitantly
Yeah,
expensive, and there's just and impractical as well. You need space to do that, and that's why nobody's done this. In addition, I would say that zoos and aquariums have a very polished propaganda program to try to convince you that they are doing several things. They're contributing to conservation, which they don't. They don't contribute to in situ conservation. Um, Returning animals to their natural habitat is often impossible, which is one reason why sanctuaries have been mentioned as a kind of intermediate form or an in-between form of captivity, because you can't simply return them to their natural habitat.
Well, maybe that jogs something I wanted to say too about sanctuaries is that, sanctuaries are still captive environments, but it affords the residents a more naturalistic environment. It's in the ocean, but we still will need to feed them because they don't know how to hunt. They don't know how to sustain themselves. They have the opportunity to hunt, and at some point they may start to do that. But it's important to know that sanctuaries are not the kind of situation where you dump them in the ocean and hope for the best.
right,
These are facilities who offer at least the same amount of quality human care that the top accredited zoos and aquariums do.
right,
Plus, it allows the animals more space, a natural environment, a more complex environment, natural environment. We don't force them to do tricks or ride people around or have people pet them. And so is it enough? No, but it's much, much better than what they have now. And that's the important point. And I think, Catherine, you can attest to that as well, working at an elephant sanctuary.
right. Yeah. Yeah, and definitely, and the autonomy that the animals have.
Autonomy.
And
So
certainly, yeah, one of the things I would say too about, the paw sanctuary is the intangibles are so important, and that's the quiet that these animals have. For us, we're not marine, obviously. We're land-based mammals, but, really it's about the quiet, it's about being immersed in nature, and also just, the respect and dignity that we give these animals as well.
yeah. And I think, it is certainly the case that we want to collaborate and work with people who are trainers, who are veterinarians, who have expertise in these with these animals, and in a good faith effort, try to give them a better life,
Yeah,
um, because they deserve it, and because we can,
yeah,
and and that's what's really important.
yeah.
Well, obviously, we've run out of time, but I really want to thank everyone for being here with us, share and allowing us to share what we found in this paper. Um, you know where to find us if you want to get in touch. We can have further discussions, and I hope that things will get better for dolphins and whales, elephants, and many other wild animals who are currently in the entertainment industry. So thank you once again, and thank you on behalf of all my co-authors, and especially Bob Jacobs and Catherine Doyle.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming today.
Thanks.